Chapter 1. The Scarf and the Summer Air. The vicarage garden was awash with laughter, lace tablecloths, and the distant rattle of teacups on saucers. Beneath a white marquee, sponge cakes and jam tarts gleamed under cellophane domes, while the Reverend Harold Lemley, red-faced and beaming, moved from group to group, with a plate of scones balanced precariously on his arm. It was, as the villagers of Fallow Ridge often said, a day too perfect for anything awful. Which, as Miss Marple once remarked, was exactly the kind of day when something dreadful usually happened. The annual garden fete was one of the social pillars of village life. It raised funds for the church roof, yes, but more importantly, it allowed the good people of Fallow Ridge to see who had put on weight, who had taken in a mysterious lodger, and who had turned up wearing a scarf in July. That last distinction belonged to Mrs. Sylvia Maitland, who arrived just before 4 o'clock. A pale silk scarf tied tightly around her neck. The scarf was of excellent quality, ivory with thin blue stripes, the kind one might find at Liberty's, and yet something about the way it clung at her throat made people glance twice. She was flushed beneath her powder and avoided the lemonade, requesting instead a small glass of water. Without ice, thank you. A few of the ladies whispered behind their fans that perhaps her nerves were at it again. Others nodded in quiet agreement. She had, after all, been through quite a bit last year, poor thing. Miss Marple, sitting alone under the shade of a fig tree, watched it all with a gentle smile. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, and a shawl of soft gray wool was folded neatly around her shoulders, despite the warm air. She did not speak unless spoken to, yet somehow she seemed to know every conversation that passed within earshot, and several that did not. Her eyes lingered, just for a moment, on the back of Mrs. Maitland's scarf as it fluttered in the breeze. Sylvia took a seat next to her cousin, Dr. Felix Maitland, near the lemonade table, and engaged in careful conversation with Mrs. Biddle from the Historical Society. Their voices were polite, but strained, like china set too close to the edge of a shelf. She hasn't been the same since the inheritance business, Mrs. Biddle was heard to say in a breathy whisper later that hour. You know, when Felix was named sole executor, one would have thought she'd at least get the cottage in Wiltshire. By 5 o'clock, most of the villagers had migrated to the far side of the garden, where the jam judging was taking place. Miss Marple, however, took a slow walk toward the hedge maze, ostensibly to inspect the new trellises. She passed Mr. Colin Tukes, a local solicitor, who was trying too hard to look as though he wasn't watching Sylvia Maitland. His collar was too tight, and he fidgeted with his pocket watch chain. The judging of the jams was won, for the 5th year running, by Mrs. Weatherby, much to the visible irritation of Mrs. Langdon, who had entered her quince preserve with great confidence this time. The air was thick with sweet congratulations and sour envy. It was not until the guests began to take their leave that the first note of unease slipped in. Reverend Lemley stood by the garden gate, offering farewells, but Sylvia Maitland was nowhere to be seen. Her empty teacup still sat on the table beside Dr. Maitland's chair, and her handbag, an expensive affair with gold fastenings, was tucked beneath it. I believe she said she needed a moment to herself, said Dr. Maitland, with an odd hitch in his voice. Perhaps she's gone to the lavatory. But after a quarter of an hour, and with the sun beginning to dip behind the trees, a certain tension began to ripple among the remaining guests. Mrs. Weatherby peered behind the rhododendrons. Young Elsie Markham checked the vicarage hall. Even Miss Marple, unhurried and precise, retraced the gravel path that led past the side gate. It was just behind the lattice fence near the edge of the garden, beneath a weeping ash, that Elsie Markham gave a shriek. Within moments, the guests came running. Sylvia Maitland was lying half-submerged in a shallow ornamental pond, one gloved hand trailing in the water, her scarf still tied around her neck. But now it had been tied twice. Once in a neat knot at the front, and again, unmistakably, at the back, pulled tight. Miss Marple, standing at the fringe of the gathering crowd, looked down at the poor woman, and her pale blue eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Chapter 2. The village stirs uneasily. By the next morning, the vicarage garden party had transformed from a cheerful blur of bunting and Battenberg into a source of solemn muttering. Fallow Ridge did not often wake to murder, and certainly not the sort that involved silk scarves and ornamental ponds. But when it did so thoroughly, gossip unfurled faster than ivy up a church wall. By 9 o'clock, the postmistress had already repeated her version of events to 5 different customers, each time with greater precision. I said to Elsie just the other day, didn't I, Elsie, that Mrs. Maitland didn't look herself. Pale as pastry she was. You can't tell me she wasn't frightened of something. The constable, young Sergeant Nigel Green, had arrived at the vicarage within the hour, summoned hastily from the next village over. With his 2 clean boots and apologetic manner, he looked more suited to escorting cows off roads than solving murders. He cordoned off the garden with a length of scratchy rope, and posted himself, rather uselessly, by the gate, as though someone might try to commit another crime before luncheon. Dr. Maitland was the last to leave the garden party the night before, after the body had been removed. He had remained with the Reverend in the drawing-room, answering questions in a dry, barely audible voice. She must have slipped, he'd said. Perhaps she became dizzy. She'd had dizzy spells before. It's possible she fell. But nobody in Fallow Ridge quite believed that. Not with the scarf tied so tightly. Not with Sylvia's expression, lips parted just slightly, as though she had tried to speak but had been interrupted. Miss Marple, for her part, had spent the morning as she usually did, sitting near the window in her parlor, knitting something pale and shapeless, while the clock ticked softly behind her. Her niece, Flora, had dropped by to check on her, flustered and pink-cheeked. A murder, Aunt Jane. And right at the vicarage garden party, too. Do you think it could have been someone from outside the village? I rather doubt it, Miss Marple said mildly, not looking up from her knitting. It's quite difficult to strangle someone with a scarf without them making a fuss, unless you know precisely when they're alone. Flora blinked. But surely someone would have seen something. Not if they were looking the wrong way, Miss Marple replied, and resumed counting stitches. Elsewhere in the village, people had begun gathering at the high street grocer's, not out of any need for shopping, but because it was where talk now congregated. Mr. Tukes, the solicitor, was there early. Buying biscuits he had no intention of eating. He chatted quietly with Miss Harding, the schoolmistress, who had always held the opinion that Sylvia Maitland's nerves were exaggerated and bordered on the theatrical. I suppose they'll want to speak with everyone who attended, Miss Harding said, as she selected a jar of marmalade she did not need. They already have, Mr. Tukes replied, glancing out the window. The sergeant came round to mine this morning. Basic questions, mostly. How long did I know Mrs. Maitland? What did I observe at the fete? That sort of thing. Very clumsy approach, I must say. Miss Harding nodded grimly. It's obvious the poor woman had enemies. At the far end of the village, in the room above the old sweet shop she rented, Elsie Markham was still shaken. She had found the body, after all. Her mother was keeping her home from work, insisting she lie down and sip tea with far too much sugar. Elsie stared at the ceiling. She looked surprised, Elsie said faintly, like she'd just realized something important. Her mother patted her hand and changed the subject to rhubarb. By midday, Sergeant Green had finally summoned the coroner from the nearby market town of Fenley. A brief inspection had confirmed what Miss Marple already knew. The second knot in the scarf had been deliberate and forceful. Sylvia Maitland had not tripped into the pond. She had been strangled. When the Reverend Lemley learned of this, he went rather gray and had to sit down. "In my garden," he said softly, "in broad daylight." Miss Marple arrived shortly after, ostensibly to bring a tin of lemon biscuits she had baked that morning. She insisted the Reverend eat one. "You must keep your strength, Reverend," and listened politely while he attempted to recall every moment of the party with agonizing precision. "No one heard a scream, you say?" she asked gently. "No, not a sound, though I do recall she seemed off. Frightened, perhaps. I asked if she was quite well, and she said she was only tired. And no one else left the main lawn during the judging. None that I saw, though I admit I wasn't watching every movement. I think Dr. Maitland went in for a short while, said he needed to check his wristwatch battery, though that struck me as odd. Why not wait until he got home?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Indeed." By the afternoon, the entire village had heard of Dr. Maitland's peculiar errand and the odd timing of it. A whisper campaign had begun to form. After all, hadn't there been a dispute between the cousins after old Mr. Maitland died last autumn? Hadn't there been talk, quiet, naturally, that Sylvia had expected a share of the estate and been disappointed? The will, it turned out, had been drawn up by Mr. Tukes and left the bulk of the inheritance, including the Wiltshire property, to Felix Maitland alone. Sylvia had received a modest trust and, apparently, a few family trinkets. It had been a source of some bitterness, though no one had spoken of it openly. Now it was being spoken of very openly indeed. That evening, as shadows lengthened and the first signs of storm clouds rolled over the hills, Miss Marple sat once again in her parlor with her knitting in her lap. Her radio hummed softly in the background, tuned low to avoid distraction. She had not spoken to Dr. Maitland yet, nor to Colin Tukes, nor even to poor Elsie, but she was thinking, as she always did, about patterns, not in wool, but in people. And something about this one didn't quite match. "A scarf tied twice," she murmured, threading her yarn through a loop. "Once for appearance, and once for silence." And then she began to knit more quickly, her needles clicking like the ticking of a distant clock. Chapter 3. The Man with the Untidy Desk. The morning after the coroner's pronouncement, a mild rain fell over Fallow Ridge. It was not enough to soak the hedgerows, but enough to dampen tempers and keep the village indoors, where curtains twitched and tea was brewed stronger than usual. Miss Marple, however, took her mackintosh and umbrella and walked the short distance to the solicitor's office just beyond the War Memorial. The brass plate on the door still read, "C. Tukes and Partners," though everyone knew there were no partners, and never had been. Colin Tukes was a man of tidy suits and untidy drawers, with thinning hair that he kept flattened down as though afraid of offending anyone with boldness. Miss Marple had once compared him quietly to a frightened hedgehog in cufflinks. She was shown in at once. Clients of Miss Marple's generation rarely needed appointments, and found Mr. Tooks hunched behind a desk overflowing with correspondence and paperweights shaped like badgers. He sprang up when he saw her. "Miss Marple, a surprise and a pleasure. Please, do sit down. Just let me move these files. I won't take much of your time," she said pleasantly, settling herself into the chair opposite. "Only, I thought it might be wise, you see, for someone to take stock of what poor Mrs. Maitland has left behind. I assume you are handling her affairs." Tewks's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Yes. I drew up her will last year. Well, a codicil, technically, after the death of her uncle." Miss Marple clicked her tongue softly. "Such a sudden death. Wasn't it? Heart failure, I believe." "That's right," he said, looking quickly down at his desk. "Dr. Maitland certified it himself. No irregularities." "Of course," she said. "And the codicil, did it change anything substantial?" He cleared his throat. "Not substantially. Mrs. Maitland left most of her belongings to her cousin Felix. Some jewelry, her piano, a collection of rare books she was very fond of. Nothing remarkable. The cottage in Wiltshire, as you've no doubt heard, went entirely to Dr. Maitland under the previous will." "Yes," said Miss Marple, her knitting bag resting on her lap. "Rather a disappointment for poor Sylvia. One might say, humiliating." Tewks hesitated. "If I might say, Miss Marple, Mrs. Maitland was not an easy woman. I had the impression that there was a great deal of resentment in her dealings with Dr. Maitland. Whether justified or not, I can't say. And now she is dead," Miss Marple said gently, "strangled with her own scarf behind the vicarage hedge, while her cousin checked his wristwatch battery. Curious." Tewks let out a long breath. "It was a silly excuse, wasn't it? The wristwatch, I mean. It's not as though anyone carries spare batteries to a garden fete. People don't usually bring scarves in July either," said Miss Marple, rising slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Tewks. You've been very helpful." Back in the High Street, Miss Marple paused beneath the overhang of Beale's Butchers to avoid the worst of the rain, and watched as Elsie Markham hurried across the street with her coat unbuttoned. The girl looked pale again, her hand gripping a letter in a crumpled envelope. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the Markham residence under the innocent guise of returning a borrowed cookbook. Mrs. Markham ushered her in with the usual bustle, offering biscuits and far too sweet tea. "Elsie's just upstairs," her mother said. "Hasn't been right since that awful business. Still shaken, I'd say. Saw a doctor from Fenley, but he only gave her sleeping drops." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Such a terrible thing for a young girl to endure. Finding someone like that. Oh, it marks you." Mrs. Markham lowered her voice. "She's been muttering about a note. Some letter that Sylvia gave her, told her not to open it unless something happened. I said nonsense. But she insists." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Would you mind terribly if I said a few words to her?" Upstairs, in a small room with floral curtains and a dressing table covered in hair ribbons, Elsie sat in her armchair staring at her hands. Her face lit up faintly when she saw Miss Marple. "I didn't want to open it," she said quickly, as if defending herself. "But it felt wrong not to." "Of course," said Miss Marple, settling beside her. "It was addressed to you?" "She gave it to me that morning, before the party started. Just said, 'In case something happens, Elsie.' I thought she meant one of her dizzy spells or something. I only opened it after they took her away." She passed Miss Marple the letter. The paper was creased and faintly perfumed. Sylvia's handwriting was small and neat, but shaky in parts. If anything happens to me, it will not be an accident. Please give this note to Miss Marple. I believe I have discovered something dreadful, and someone is watching me. I dare not go to the police, not yet. It concerns Felix and something that was hidden after Uncle died. If I am wrong, let me be wrong, but if I am not, forgive me for waiting too long." Miss Marple read it twice. She did not frown. She did not speak at first. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her knitting bag. She was frightened, Elsie whispered, but I don't think it was just Dr. Maitland she was frightened of. "No," Miss Marple said softly, "nor do I." That evening, a meeting was held in the vicarage drawing-room. Reverend Lemley had invited Sergeant Green and Dr. Maitland for a preliminary exchange of impressions. Miss Marple was not formally invited, but no one was surprised when she appeared, shawl neatly folded, and sat quietly by the unlit fireplace. "I find it difficult to believe anyone here could have done such a thing," said the Reverend. "Sylvia was troubled, yes, but who would wish her harm?" Dr. Maitland, stiff and pale, kept his arms folded tightly. "She was erratic, emotional. She made threats, told me she would ruin my reputation. She believed there was something improper in Uncle's will, but she never said what." "And was there?" Miss Marple asked quietly. He hesitated. "No." The silence that followed was brief, but deep. Sergeant Green cleared his throat. "There's no evidence pointing directly to anyone. No prints. No signs of forced struggle. But if this note exists—" He turned to Miss Marple. "Do you believe it's authentic?" "I do," she said. "And I believe she truly feared someone would silence her. But who and why remains unclear. I shall think on it, Sergeant." Outside, the rain began again, heavier this time, tapping at the window panes like impatient fingers. And inside her knitting bag, folded between two skeins of yarn, was a letter that had already begun to unravel the fabric of the village's quiet illusion. Miss Marple sat still, eyes closed, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the paper. She had seen silk scarves tied in many ways over the years, but rarely twice. Chapter 4. An Old Letter and a Missing Box. The following morning broke sharp and clear, the clouds swept clean by the night's rain. Fallow Ridge, for all its gossip and quiet speculation, tried its best to resume normal rhythms. Bicycles wobbled down High Street. Laundry flapped nervously on clotheslines. And at the edge of the village, Miss Marple placed her Morning Post unopened beside her saucer, and sipped her tea with more thought than usual. She had not slept particularly well. Sylvia's note, folded with calm despair, rested on the table beside her. Its implications were vague, no details, no names beyond Felix's, but it was laced with unmistakable dread. And that final line, "If I am wrong, let me be wrong. But if I am not, a woman does not write such things without good reason." By mid-morning, Miss Marple had dressed and ventured to the bookshop, not for books, but for Mrs. Langdon, who worked there on Thursdays, and rarely refused a chance to indulge in light conspiracy. "Such a terrible thing," Mrs. Langdon said at once, before Miss Marple had even crossed the threshold. "A murder in Fallow Ridge. Can you imagine?" "Not since the business with the poisoned scones in '42. Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "I recall. Terrible fuss over nothing in the end. Turned out to be a case of foxglove tea mistaken for elderflower." "Oh, yes," Mrs. Langdon said, flicking dust from a shelf of gardening almanacs. "But this business now, Sylvia Maitland, well, I can't say I'm surprised. She was high-strung, that one, always looking over her shoulder. And yet, said Miss Marple delicately, she never left. Even after the inheritance was settled, one might have expected her to move away. Mrs. Langdon gave a sniff. Oh, she couldn't, wouldn't. That house, she lived in it as though she were waiting for something. Always said she had more right to it than anyone else, especially Felix. I understand she was sorting through her uncle's papers just before the fete. So, I've heard, something about an old account box. Went missing, didn't it? One of those strong metal things with a combination. She asked Colin Tukes about it, but he said he'd never seen it. Miss Marple tilted her head. Interesting. After a few more pleasantries, she made her way to the late Mr. Maitland's residence on Maple Row, where Dr. Felix Maitland now lived alone. The house was a narrow, ivy-covered structure, with heavy curtains and the smell of dried herbs clinging faintly to the walls. Felix answered the door, looking tired and slightly flustered. "Miss Marple," he said, surprised but polite. "Is this about Sylvia?" "In part," she said. "May I come in for a moment? I won't impose." He nodded and stepped aside. The drawing-room was cluttered with medical journals and cracked leather chairs. On the mantel, an empty pipe rack stood beside a brass clock that had stopped at 11:40. Miss Marple took a seat and folded her hands. "I was wondering, Doctor," she began gently, "about the box your uncle kept. A metal document case. Sylvia mentioned it before she died." He stiffened slightly. "I've heard of it, yes. My uncle was very particular about his papers. She believed there were amendments to the will inside, proof, she claimed, that he intended to split the property between us. But the box was never found. And yet, Miss Marple said, she was convinced it had been, or at least that it had been moved." He frowned. "Miss Marple, do you mean to imply—" "I imply nothing," she said, her voice calm. "Only that when a woman believes she is being watched, it is often because she is." "Did she ever mention whom she suspected?" Felix exhaled through his nose, slowly. "She hinted it was Colin Tukes. She thought he was hiding something about the will. I told her it was absurd. He has nothing to gain." Miss Marple said softly. "Nothing to gain. Unless, of course, he had already gained something, and was frightened it might be taken away." Felix stood abruptly. "If you'll excuse me, I have patients this afternoon." Miss Marple rose. "Of course. I hope I haven't troubled you." She left without another word, her steps light as she made her way to the path that cut across the churchyard. There, she found young Elsie Markham sitting on a stone bench near the yew tree, her gaze lost in thought. "Miss Marple," she said softly, as the older woman approached. "I remembered something else." Miss Marple sat beside her. "Yes, my dear?" "The day before the party, I helped Sylvia carry boxes down from the attic. She was looking for old bank statements. She said she needed to prove something. There was this one box, heavy, with a little lock on it. She called it the key to everything." "What happened to it?" "She left it in her wardrobe. I know, because I saw her put it there. But after she died, the police said there was no such box in the house." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And you told them this?" "I tried, but they just patted my hand and said I was confused. Said it was probably a jewelry box. No, Elsie, I think you were quite right." That evening, Miss Marple paid another unannounced call, this time to Colin Tukes. He looked startled to see her again so soon. "Miss Marple? I wonder if I might have just a moment more of your time. There's a matter that's been troubling me." He ushered her in, reluctantly. "Tell me," she said, when they were seated again. Do you recall being asked by Sylvia Maitland about her uncle's metal account box? He looked flustered. Yes. She asked me about it last month. I told her the truth. I never saw such a box." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. How curious, then, that the box was seen in her wardrobe the very day before she died. Tukes went pale. "That's impossible." "Is it?" she said quietly. "Because I rather think you knew where it was all along. I rather think someone made it disappear after she died." He swallowed hard. "I imagine," she continued gently, "you assumed no one would believe a maid over a solicitor. Miss Marple," but she was already standing. "You see," she said, "I've always believed that truth, like lavender, lingers longer than one expects. You may not see it at first, but it finds its way into the air." As she left, the sky above Fallow Ridge turned a pale violet, and the wind carried the faint scent of something older than memory. Miss Marple, as ever, followed the current, not of evidence, but of people, and someone, somewhere, had been afraid of what that old metal box might say. Chapter 5. Tea with Reverend Lemley. By the following afternoon, the quiet mood of Fallow Ridge had curdled into something denser. Not grief exactly, but a careful watchfulness. As if the hedgerows themselves were listening, shopkeepers paused their weighing of sugar, and letters were opened twice, in case they missed something the first time. Everyone had an opinion now, and all of them were wrong. Sergeant Green had taken to pacing the lanes like a sheepdog with no flock. The official inquest was scheduled for the following week, but unofficially, the villagers had already chosen their suspects. Mrs. Langdon swore it was Felix. He always did look like someone with something to hide, while the butcher's boy claimed it must have been that solicitor fellow, with his pocket watch and shifty eyes. And all the while, Miss Marple walked quietly among them, noticing the things they missed. A pause too long before a name, a tremor in the hands while stirring tea, a glance over the shoulder that had no cause. It was with this in mind that she accepted an invitation to tea at the vicarage. Reverend Lemley, a sincere and often flustered man, had sent his curate with a note handwritten, in thick, upright letters. "Do come, dear Miss Marple. I feel your insights might be rather useful, in a spiritual sense, of course." She arrived at 4 o'clock sharp, shawl folded neatly, her gloves tucked in her handbag. The vicar's sitting room smelled of lemon polish and prayer books. There were slices of Battenberg on a plate, and a tray of teacups with one already poured. Reverend Lemley rose when she entered. "Ah, Miss Marple, thank you for coming. I've found I have no taste for silence this week." "Nor does it often have a taste for you, Reverend," she said kindly, settling into the chair beside the hearth. He gave a rueful smile. "True, though silence is better than speculation. Poor Sylvia. And now everyone's whispering about Felix and wills and boxes, as though our village had turned into a cheap cereal." Miss Marple accepted her tea. "No milk. There's rarely anything cheap about murder, Reverend." They sipped quietly for a moment, and then he leaned forward. "I must confess something. I saw something at the garden fete." Only for a moment. Miss Marple said nothing, but her expression encouraged him to continue. "Just before the jam judging, I stepped behind the marquee to retrieve a hymn book someone had left on a bench. As I turned back, I saw Sylvia speaking with someone near the hedge. I couldn't see clearly, only the back of the other figure, but it was a man, I'm certain, and they were arguing." "Arguing how?" He hesitated. She was pointing, not shouting. No, her voice was low, but her hand was raised. Accusatory, almost. and then he took her by the arm, not roughly, but firmly, and led her around the side, out of view. Could you describe the man? Dark coat, tall. I assumed at the time it was Felix, but now— Miss Marple looked into her teacup. It may have been. Do you think so? I think, she said carefully, that someone was worried about what Sylvia might reveal, and I think she very nearly did. The vicar looked troubled. There was something else. That scarf of hers. She was wearing it much too tightly, even before she died. Yes, said Miss Marple. I thought so too. After tea, she stopped at the churchyard. The wind had picked up, and petals from the rose bushes danced across the gravel path like scraps of old lace. She paused at a familiar headstone. Edmund Maitland, 1874-1953. Devoted brother, fiercely just. The inscription had always struck her as curious, fiercely just, an odd epitaph for a country gentleman. Nearby, she spotted Sergeant Green kneeling beside the ornamental pond. He was poking at the base with a gloved hand and looked rather like a boy trying to rescue a marble. "Miss Marple," he called when he noticed her. "Come to see the scene of the crime?" She smiled politely. "Just walking. You found something?" "Bit of a chain," he said, holding it up. "From a pendant or a handbag, maybe. Could have broken off during the struggle." "Where precisely did you find it?" "Wedged between the rocks, under the moss. Could have been there before, but seems recent. Fresh soil and all that." "Interesting," said Miss Marple. "I wonder if Sylvia wore any jewelry that day. She had a brooch, I think. Pale green. Glass, maybe. Looked like something from a drawer, not a shop." Miss Marple filed that away. "And you found no fingerprints, no impressions in the soil?" Green grimaced. "Too many people walked about before we cordoned it off. Half the village trampled through. We'd be lucky to find our own footprints." She nodded. "Then it's the kind of case that requires quieter methods." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, going over her notes in a slim, leather-bound journal. She had catalogued her observations: the scarf, tied twice, the missing document box, the mysterious man behind the marquee, and now this, an unknown pendant chain near the pond. But it was not the items themselves that puzzled her. It was the patterns between them, the timing of the death, the inheritance, the relationships. It was, in her view, a tapestry slowly revealing its true image. She turned to a fresh page and wrote a name. Mrs. Abigail Tukes, Colin Tukes's sister. A quiet woman who lived alone above the haberdashery and rarely spoke at length to anyone. She had been at the fete, too. Miss Marple had seen her near the trestle tables, arranging doilies. A seemingly harmless presence. But Miss Marple remembered something odd. She had seen Mrs. Tukes and Sylvia Maitland speak briefly behind the lemonade tent. The conversation had been hushed, tense, and Mrs. Tukes had been wearing gloves. White kid gloves. In July. That, Miss Marple thought, was worth investigating. She closed the journal softly, the room filled with the gentle click of the mantel clock. Outside, the village dimmed beneath the twilight, and behind shuttered windows, secrets lay curled like cats, still, but not asleep. Not yet. Miss Marple rose, set her shawl on the chair, and prepared her teapot. Tomorrow would bring visitors, or perhaps a confrontation, and she intended to be ready. Chapter 6. Gloves in the linen drawer. The next morning, Miss Marple rose early. The air outside her window smelled faintly of clover and smoke, and a blackbird sang from the chimney-pot with unnecessary confidence. It would be another deceptively calm day in Fallow Ridge, a village with hydrangeas by every gate and something deeply unsettled in its core. She prepared a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. Inside, a lemon cake she had baked before breakfast, just the sort Mrs. Abigail Tukes liked. Miss Marple had long since learned that one need not pry to be told secrets. One merely needed to show up at the right time with something warm and homemade. By 9:30, she was knocking on the side door of the haberdashery, where a faded sign still read, Tukes, Threads, and Sundries. Est, 1912. The bell above the front entrance gave a half-hearted jingle as she stepped inside. The shop was dim and filled with neat rows of ribbons, pins, buttons, and fabrics in every faded hue. Abigail Tukes emerged from the curtain at the back. She was a woman of middle years, with tightly braided gray hair and the nervous air of someone always prepared to hear bad news. "Miss Marple," she said with surprise. "What a delight. Is everything all right?" "Oh, perfectly," Miss Marple said sweetly. "I was baking and thought of you. Lemon, with just a hint of almond. I remembered you once said you liked a bitter edge to your sweets." A flicker passed over Abigail's face, not quite a smile. "That's very kind. I do hope I'm not disturbing you. Might I come in for a minute?" "Of course. Forgive the mess. I was sorting fabrics." She led Miss Marple to a small sitting room behind the shop, with a wicker settee, 2 upright chairs, and a table with embroidery magazines from a decade ago. There was a framed photograph of Colin and Abigail as children on the mantelpiece. A doily rested beneath it, yellowed and perfectly starched. "I imagine the village must be wearing thin on you," Miss Marple began gently. "All the talk, I mean, about poor Sylvia." Abigail's hands fidgeted in her lap. "It's dreadful. And now, with Colin being questioned, he's not strong, Miss Marple. Not like people think. I'm afraid all this will break him." Miss Marple poured out the tea Abigail offered, noting the woman's slight tremor as she passed the cups. "It must be difficult. You've always been close." Abigail nodded. "We've always looked after each other, ever since our parents passed." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "You were at the fete, I believe. Helping with the linens?" "I always help with the tables. It's tradition." She managed a thin smile. "I ironed nearly every cloth myself." "You're very skilled with fabric," Miss Marple said, setting down her cup. "Gloves, too. I remember seeing a beautiful pair of white kid gloves on you at the party." Abigail's eyes darted away. "It was just for Son. I get red very quickly." "Of course," Miss Marple said gently. "It's only I don't recall seeing them after the judging." "I wondered if perhaps you lost them." A pause. I might have taken them off. It got warm. I suppose they're in your laundry now." Abigail's throat bobbed. "Perhaps." There was a silence, during which Miss Marple smiled kindly and cut 2 small slices of cake. She passed one across the table. "You know," she said softly, "I believe Sylvia was frightened of more than just a dispute over the will. I think she found something. Something someone wanted kept very quiet." Abigail stared at the cake. "She told Elsie about a metal box, the sort solicitors and doctors use to keep documents safe. She said it held proof of wrongdoing. I don't know anything about that," Abigail said quickly. "If there was such a box, I never saw it." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Not Sylvia's note, but a copy she had written in her own careful hand. "This is what Sylvia wrote to Elsie. She asked that it be passed to me. She was afraid." Abigail read it, lips tightening. "I think she came to you," Miss Marple continued, "because she thought you might confirm something. Something about your brother, perhaps, or about the way the will was handled." "No," Abigail said quietly. eyes fixed on the words. She came to warn me. Miss Marple's eyes did not widen. She merely waited. She said she thought someone had forged something. That Uncle Edmund's signature might have been added after his death, but she couldn't prove it without the box. She thought I might have seen it, because Colin keeps certain things here, you see, in the shop. Did you see it? Abigail hesitated, then nodded, barely. Once, a week before the fete. It was locked, and he said it was nothing, but I recognized it from Uncle's study. Did you open it? No, I should have done more, but Colin said it was personal. That she was imagining things. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. Did you confront him after Sylvia died? Abigail set her teacup down with trembling fingers. He said she slipped. He said she wasn't well, and I wanted to believe him. I did. But I haven't seen the gloves since that day. There it was. Not a confession, not quite, but something very near to it. Miss Marple touched the woman's hand gently. You must give them to the constable. Not because I believe you had a hand in anything, not directly, but because they matter, and because if you don't, someone else will find them, and it will be worse. Abigail swallowed and nodded once. They're in the linen drawer. I kept them there because I didn't know what to do. Miss Marple stood slowly. You've done what you can, and now it's up to the truth. By late afternoon, Sergeant Green had the gloves sealed in an evidence envelope and had begun preparations to bring in Colin Tukes for further questioning. But Miss Marple knew, with a deep and quiet certainty, that this was not quite the end. Someone else had handled that scarf. Someone whose name had not yet been spoken aloud, and she meant to speak it soon, but not until she had invited Dr. Maitland for tea, alone, because there was one question she had saved especially for him, and the answer, she suspected, would tie the second knot. Chapter 7. Tea with the Doctor. It was just past 4 when Dr. Felix Maitland knocked on Miss Marple's door, removing his hat as he stepped inside with the polite reserve of a man who suspected he was being summoned for reasons beyond the pleasantries of tea. He wore a charcoal gray suit that looked a fraction too heavy for the weather, and his eyes, though alert, had the faint hollowness of a man who hadn't slept well in several nights. Miss Marple, as always, was perfectly composed. A fresh pot of Darjeeling steamed between 2 porcelain cups, and a plate of shortbread sat untouched on the side table. She ushered him into the sitting room with quiet grace, and motioned toward the armchair near the hearth. "Doctor," she said with a pleasant smile, "thank you for coming. I expect you've been rather occupied of late." Felix nodded, folding his hands. "That would be fair to say. My patients are as distressed by the murder as anyone else. More so, perhaps. They've begun to see symptoms in every ache and cough. A murder will do that," she replied. "And of course, the inquest looming doesn't help." He took the offered cup, but did not drink. "If I'm to be honest, Miss Marple, I had hoped we might avoid such formalities. I find the whole business ugly. Sylvia was complicated, but no one deserves to die like that." "No," said Miss Marple gently, "no one does." A brief silence followed. Outside, sparrows rustled noisily in the ivy. Miss Marple adjusted the silver sugar tongs with slow care. "You were close to your uncle, weren't you?" she asked, not looking at him. Edmund Maitland was by all accounts a formidable man. Felix leaned back slightly. He was stern, principled, difficult to please, but I respected him. "And he respected you?" There was a pause. "I'd like to think so. He left me the estate." "Yes," said Miss Marple, and Sylvia did not take that well. She felt entitled. My uncle saw through that. He knew she was wasteful, emotionally unstable, and perhaps knew something he didn't wish recorded in a will, she interjected softly. Felix's jaw stiffened. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple sipped her tea. She believed a codicil existed, a change to the will. She thought she'd found something in that metal document box, something damning. She imagined things, he said flatly. She always did. And yet, Miss Marple murmured, you told the Reverend you were fetching a battery for your watch during the fete. Rather an odd errand, wasn't it? Felix gave a hollow laugh. Yes, I admit it wasn't the best excuse. I needed a moment alone. Indeed, to retrieve something, perhaps. He set his teacup down. Miss Marple, am I being interrogated? No, she said. You're being spoken to by someone who knows people, Doctor. Not crimes, people. He didn't reply. She leaned forward slightly. Did you know that Sylvia wrote a letter before she died? Gave it to young Elsie Markham in case anything happened to her? Felix's expression shifted, but only just. I'd heard rumors. She named you in it. She believed you had something to hide about the will, something worth silencing her for. Then she was wrong. Perhaps. But you see, what troubles me, Doctor, is not the scarf alone. It's the way it was tied. Felix blinked. Silk, Miss Marple continued, can be tricky. It slips. Hard to knot twice unless you know what you're doing. But medical professionals, surgeons for instance, they know their knots. Felix stood abruptly. You're accusing me. I'm pointing out something peculiar, she said calmly. A scarf tied too tightly. Twice. A medical knot, perhaps. And now a letter emerges. And gloves. Bloodless, yes, but scented faintly with camphor, which I believe your sister used to keep in her drawers. You see how all these threads begin to gather? I had nothing to do with Sylvia's death. Perhaps not directly, Miss Marple said, but you saw her that day. You argued. You may have taken something from the document box. I took nothing, he said coldly. But someone did, Miss Marple said. And if you didn't, Doctor, then perhaps you know who did. He stared at her. She was trying to protect someone in the end, wasn't she? She said. I believe she thought the truth would be enough. But someone else panicked, someone who knew just how close she was. I didn't kill her, he said again, more quietly. Miss Marple gave a small nod. I don't think you did. Felix looked up, startled. You don't? No, she said, voice soft as felt. But I think you know who did. And you've been protecting them. He sat again, heavily. After a moment, he spoke. Colin came to me the morning after Sylvia died, said he'd burned some papers. Said he was afraid it looked bad, that Sylvia had accused him of forging a clause in the will. I told him I wanted no part in it. But I didn't go to the police. Why not? He looked ashamed, because if he had forged it, then I benefited. The house, the estate, everything. And the gloves? She asked. He shook his head. Not his. He wouldn't wear gloves. Abigail. She cleans up after him sometimes. She might have, I don't know. Would you testify to this? He hesitated. Miss Marple poured more tea. Justice does not undo what has happened, but it prevents the next tragedy. And in villages like ours, Doctor, that matters more than most know. He nodded slowly. That night, long after the lamps were lit in the vicarage windows and the butcher's cat curled beneath the rain barrel, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, a single candle flickering beside her. There was still one knot left to untangle, and she would do it with quiet hands and patient thread. For the truth, she believed, always tied itself twice, once in the facts and once in the heart. Chapter 8. The Lavender Box. The next morning dawned crisp and strangely bright, as if the air itself had been scrubbed clean overnight. The clouds hung in gauzy threads above the hedgerows, and the birds in the churchyard sang with unusual insistence. Fallow Ridge, for all its murmured unease and half-formed suspicions, woke to a kind of false peace. Miss Marple knew better than to trust such a day. She had not slept more than a few hours. Her mind had worked steadily through the night, piecing together words unsaid and movements only half observed. She rose early, brewed her tea, and carefully selected a lilac brooch for her collar before slipping on her shawl and gloves. At precisely 9 o'clock, she stood once more at the front door of Tuke's Threads and Sundries. The bell above the shop gave its little chime as she entered. Abigail Tukes was behind the counter, her expression unreadable. "I thought you might come," Abigail said quietly, setting down a tin of buttons. "You've always been very perceptive," Miss Marple replied. "Is your brother in?" Abigail hesitated, then nodded. "He's upstairs, packing." "Packing?" "He says he needs a few days away, somewhere quiet." Miss Marple said. "Is that what he needs, or what you need him to believe?" Abigail did not answer. Miss Marple moved through the back hallway, past shelves lined with bolts of calico and carded lace, and paused before the door at the top of the narrow stairs. She knocked once, then let herself in. Colin Tukes stood beside a small trunk, its lid propped open, half filled with folded shirts and an umbrella. He turned with visible irritation, which softened only slightly upon seeing her. "Miss Marple," he said with a weary sigh, "is this another round of polite inquisition?" "I've never found the truth to be impolite," she replied. "Merely overdue." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I told the constable everything. I panicked, burned a few old letters. There's nothing criminal in that." "Possibly not," said Miss Marple. "But the forgery was criminal. The one that ensured Dr. Maitland inherited the entirety of his uncle's estate." He stiffened. "There's no proof." "There was," she said calmly. "Sylvia believes she found it. That's why she confronted you behind the marquee, isn't it?" Colin said nothing. "She may not have opened the metal box yet, but she knew what she was looking for, and she intended to go to the authorities. She didn't," he said bitterly, "and now she can't." Miss Marple stepped further into the room. "You see, Mr. Tukes, it was never the will itself that mattered to her. It was the principle. She believed that justice had been denied, and she intended to restore it." "She was always dramatic," he muttered. "Was she? Or merely correct?" Colin turned away. His shoulders hunched. "She would have destroyed my career. Over something that wouldn't have changed anything. The estate would still have gone to Felix. But she wanted a scandal." "No," said Miss Marple. "She wanted recognition, and she wanted you to admit what you'd done." There was silence for a long moment. Then he said, "She wasn't supposed to die." Miss Marple's voice remained steady. "Did you follow her to the garden path?" "I only meant to frighten her," he said, barely above a whisper. "To make her drop it. She wouldn't. She said she was going to expose me. To you. To everyone. She reached for her handbag. I thought she was going for the letter, so I grabbed her scarf, just to stop her. She struggled. I panicked, and tightened the knot," Miss Marple said. He sank onto the edge of the bed, hands shaking. "I tied it once to keep it in place. But then I pulled, too hard. I don't remember the second knot. But someone else does." Colin looked up. "What?" Miss Marple reached into her bag and withdrew a small lavender-colored box, the kind used for perfume or heirloom gloves. She placed it gently on the desk beside the window. "I found this in Abigail's linen drawer," she said. "She told me she hid it there the morning after Sylvia died. It contains the gloves she wore at the fete. And one other thing." Colin said nothing. Miss Marple opened the lid. Inside, nestled in white tissue, was a single folded page, a torn corner of Sylvia's notebook. The writing on it was faded, but legible. "If I do not return by 5, the box is no longer in my possession. Someone has taken it. I believe it to be someone I once trusted." She gave this to Abigail just before the judging. Miss Marple said, "Asked her to keep it safe. Your sister has been protecting you, but she's reached the end of what she can bear." Colin stared at the letter, then lowered his face into his hands. "I didn't mean to," he said. "You must believe that." "Belief," Miss Marple said softly, "has little bearing on truth. The truth is, you killed her, however clumsily, however suddenly. The scarf did not tie itself." He said nothing more. Outside the shop, the village had begun to stir. The postman walked past with a nod, and a child ran past chasing a hoop, her laughter light and incongruous. Miss Marple returned to her cottage with the lavender box in her satchel and the weight of finality in her step. That evening, Sergeant Green came to collect the evidence. There would be an arrest in the morning, he said. But Miss Marple knew that justice had already begun to settle itself. That night, she opened her window just slightly, letting the cool breeze slip through. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. And in her knitting basket, the unfinished scarf sat untouched. She wouldn't be tying it tonight. Chapter 9. The Truth at 3:05. The next morning arrived as quietly as the end of a dream. In Fallow Ridge, the mist clung to the meadows like lace left out overnight, and the hedgerows were heavy with dew. Word traveled faster than the church bell, though the bell, too, rang out sharply at 8 o'clock, as if to confirm what the village already sensed. Colin Tukes had been arrested. Sergeant Green made no ceremony of it. Only a brief knock at the rear of the haberdashery, a muttered exchange, and then the quiet clip of shoes down the lane. Miss Marple watched from her parlor window, shawl wrapped firmly around her shoulders. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only a delicate resignation, like someone watching the last leaf fall from a tree. A short time later, Abigail Tukes arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. She was not crying. Abigail rarely allowed herself that. But her cheeks were hollowed. And her voice came from a place so deep and exhausted, it barely rose above a whisper. "I thought I could contain it," she said, seated across from Miss Marple at the little round table near the window. "I told myself it would pass, that it was a moment of madness, but I knew. Even before Colin said a word, I knew." Miss Marple poured tea with a steady hand. "You tried to protect him. That is not uncommon. I burned the second half of that letter," Abigail said, her fingers twisting in her lap. "The part Sylvia wrote after she spoke to him. It said everything plainly. But I couldn't bear for it to be seen. I thought, if I destroyed it, I might destroy the outcome too." Miss Marple touched her hand gently. "And yet, something remains." "I suppose so." They sat in silence for a time. Outside, the shops opened slowly. The butcher's lad delivered parcels with uncharacteristic solemnity. At the post office, Mrs. Nettle folded every envelope with care, as though the paper itself might bruise. Fallow Ridge had been rattled, and, while no one said it aloud, the whole village walked a little slower, spoke a little softer. There had been something personal about Sylvia Maitland's death, something too close to home. She had not been a stranger or a wicked outsider. She had been one of them. And someone else, someone just as familiar, had been capable of killing her. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected caller. It was Elsie Markham. The girl looked paler than usual but composed. She wore a simple gray coat, one button missing, and carried a small brown envelope. "I thought I should give you this," she said, holding it out. Miss Marple motioned her inside. "What is it, dear?" Elsie sat stiffly on the edge of the settee. "It's a note Sylvia gave me. Not the same one as before. A second one. She gave it to me at the party. Said if anything happened to the first letter, I should keep this hidden until the day after the fete." Miss Marple opened the envelope. The paper inside was torn from a notebook, the ink darker and firmer than in the earlier letter. Sylvia's handwriting had an urgency it hadn't before. "If this reaches you, something has gone very wrong. There are 2 people I suspect, but only one I fear. Colin forged the codicil, I am nearly certain, but Felix knew. He let it happen. There is a second page in the metal box. I have written everything. I'm afraid if I don't do something now, it will be lost. I will go to the fete and speak with them both. If I don't come back, please find Miss Marple. She will understand." Miss Marple folded the letter with the care one reserves for something both fragile and decisive. She looked up at Elsie, who was twisting her gloves in her lap. "You've done the right thing," she said. "This will settle much that was in doubt." Elsie hesitated. "I heard my mother say that you already solved it. That Mr. Tukes was the killer." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but sometimes solving a crime is not the same as understanding it." She sat with the girl for a while, serving tea and asking after her work at the sweet shop. It was not just kindness. It was repair. A girl who had found a body and held a secret for days must be gently returned to the world. After Elsie left, Miss Marple prepared for a final visit. She walked slowly to the Maitland house on Maple Row. The gate creaked as she opened it. The garden was overgrown in places, and a single gardenia bush drooped beneath the weight of neglect. Dr. Maitland answered the door in his shirt sleeves. He looked tired, but not surprised. "I thought you might come," he said. Miss Marple stepped inside. He poured 2 cups of tea without asking, and led her to the same room as before. The mantel clock ticked softly. "I received word from Sergeant Green," he said. "Colin confessed more or less. He says it was a scuffle, an accident. That he only meant to scare her. Do you believe him?" Felix stared into his cup. "Not really. Colin doesn't do anything without calculation. I think he meant to silence her. Not kill her, perhaps. But enough to stop her." Miss Marple took a breath. "She named you in her second letter. Said she believed you knew of the forgery." He didn't flinch. "I did. You allowed it." "Yes. And profited." "Yes." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Why?" Felix's mouth twitched. "Because I was tired of being the dutiful cousin. I cared for Uncle Edmund until his final breath. Sylvia never lifted a finger, and yet she acted like the world owed her something. So you rationalized it. I convinced myself it was harmless," he said quietly. "That it would do no real damage. That it would spare everyone the mess of division. But it wasn't harmless." "No," Miss Marple said, "because someone died for it." Felix looked away. "I'll give a statement," he said, after a long pause. "I won't lie. Not any more." Miss Marple stood slowly. "Good. That's all I hoped for." As she made her way back through the village, the light was beginning to change. The sun dipped behind the trees in long amber shafts, and the scent of smoke rose from kitchen chimneys. Miss Marple paused on the church path and looked out across the fields. It was, once again, a place of stillness and pale skies. But beneath the surface, Fallow Ridge had changed. Secrets had been unearthed. And truth, twisted, delayed, resisted, had finally arrived. At 3:05, Chapter 10, The Scarf That Tied Itself Twice. The inquest was held a week later in the parish hall, a solemn, stuffy affair with folding chairs and polished floors where the echoes of village fetes still seemed to linger in the corners. A large attendance was expected, though few claimed they were going for curiosity's sake. Out of respect for the deceased, they all said, and perhaps it was true. But the scent of scandal clung faintly to every coat lapel. Miss Marple sat in the second row, unassuming in her gray tweed and dove-blue hat. She neither fidgeted nor whispered as the coroner called the matter to order. The facts were laid out with clinical detachment. Sylvia Maitland, age 43, found deceased at the vicarage garden party. Cause of death, ligature strangulation via silk scarf. A blunt verdict. And yet the village leaned forward, waiting not for the facts, but for the name. That name, of course, was Colin Tukes. His confession had already circulated by the time the inquest began. He had admitted to confronting Sylvia behind the hedge, grabbing her scarf in a panic when she threatened exposure. What he did not admit, what remained a quiet but damning truth, was that the scarf had not only tightened once, but twice. The coroner's report did not linger on the second knot, though it had been mentioned. A separate, securing knot, it read. Tightened post-mortem. It was filed among the oddities of the case, never fully explored in court. Miss Marple, however, never forgot it, for she had known from the beginning that a scarf tied twice was not merely accidental, it was intentional, purposeful. It spoke not only to guilt, but to grief, or something close to it. And that answer, too, had come, quietly, at dusk 2 evenings before the inquest, when Abigail Tukes returned to Miss Marple's cottage with pale cheeks and a pale envelope. It was me, Abigail had whispered, after she was dead. I found her before Elsie did. I saw the scarf, one knot. But it looked so careless, so exposed. I thought, if I just tightened it, finished it, it might seem neater, might make it look like someone else, like she'd done it herself. I wasn't thinking clearly. Miss Marple had said nothing for a time. She had simply taken Abigail's hand and held it. Grief wears many faces. Panic is not always violent. But the truth, in the end, remained whole. At the inquest's close, the coroner declared the death a homicide and recommended formal charges be brought. Colin Tukes would stand trial. Dr. Felix Maitland submitted a sworn statement acknowledging his knowledge of the forged codicil and his failure to report it, though he would not be charged with complicity. The estate would be re-evaluated in light of these disclosures, and Sylvia Maitland, at long last, was granted justice, not from a magistrate's bench, but through the slow, steady work of one elderly lady with knitting needles and a preternatural sense for human weakness. 2 days later, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage garden. The fate bunting had long since been taken down, and the ornamental pond was quiet again, its surface rippling only with wind and memory. The copper beech cast a long shadow over the lawn, and the hedge at the far end was being trimmed carefully by the vicar's new groundsman, a young lad from Basingstoke, who, one hoped, would bring fewer mysteries with him. Reverend Lemley joined her after a time, holding 2 cups of tea. "I suppose things will settle now," he said, passing her a cup. "They always do," Miss Marple said, "until the next knot is tied." He chuckled faintly. "You never cease to amaze me, Miss Marple. No fingerprints, no weapon, no clear witness, and yet you saw it all." "I saw only what was already there," she said gently. "The scarf was the beginning, tied once for presentation, then tied again for concealment. That second knot always speaks louder." They sat for a time, watching the breeze move through the tall grass beyond the vicarage wall. "Do you ever wish," the Reverend asked, "that you hadn't noticed?" Miss Marple thought for a long moment. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but one can't unsee a pattern once it's begun. You may ignore the first stitch, perhaps the second, but by the third you know what's being woven. And this one—" She looked down into her tea. It was a design laid by desperation, someone afraid of loss, another afraid of exposure, and someone else, silent, dutiful, afraid of her own brother. Reverend Lemley bowed his head. "God help us." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Let's hope he still does." Later, as she returned to her own garden, the world seemed just a fraction quieter. The rose bushes had begun to bloom again, early for the season, and the bees hummed with renewed confidence. Miss Marple sat beneath the shade of her fig tree and opened her knitting bag. The scarf she had been working on, the one with the pale gray wool and the uneven edge, was nearly done now. Only a few inches remained. She threaded the yarn through, her hands as steady as ever. It would be finished by sunset, and she would never tie it twice.